So last week I clicked on the first video on my series on the Russian Navy and, well, to be honest, I couldn't listen to it for long. I am very sorry I put you all through that absolute horror show that looks like it was made on a potato and sounds like I was sitting neck deep in a human-sized jar of Vegemite. So without further ado, and given the fact that my new PC has finally arrived and I can put this up in 4K, I present to you the Voyage of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the Voyage of the Damned, with some new bits, but most importantly, new audio. I wanted to celebrate getting close to 50k and really sort of hitting that milestone that I originally set out to hit when I first started, so thank you all. I will put this out as soon as I have it finished, and, well, all I can say is, and then it got worse. Boats. They're kinda cool. They do cool things, and they allow countries to be big boys on the world stage. But Russia, they never really got the whole Navy thing down well, with a few exceptions. From there, it's, well, a litany of utter incompetence, disaster, and misery. Right up through the Russian Imperial Navy, the Soviet Navy, and to the modern Russian Navy, which you can draw parallels between all three services as they are built off the same bricks. So hold on to your hats, get a drink, sit down, because as you all know, and as the saying goes when it comes to Russian naval history, and then it got worse. Imagine, if you will, your countrymen have been attacked. They are under siege in the far-off Port Arthur, and only you, in Europe, can sail to their rescue. The brave Variag fought valiantly, ambushed by a superior force, and has been lost. But you must get there quickly, because without your help, it is all going to go wrong. This is the exact position that the Russian Baltic Fleet found itself in during the Russo-Japanese War in October 1904. The Tsar had sent Admiral Makarov, a very capable officer and quite possibly the best admiral Russia had ever produced, to the Far East, and he began to turn things around very, very quickly. However, he was decapitated when the Petropavlovsk hit a mine. It's a bit morbid. Enter stage right Admiral Zinoy Petrovich Roshesvensky, also known by his nickname Mad Dog, a man who I feel so sorry for that I want to give him a hug and about 73 pints of vodka. Under Roshesvensky's command, a large fleet was accumulated in St. Petersburg and the surrounding naval bases for a voyage to the Far East with the intention of smashing the Japanese fleet, pushing into Port Arthur, and winning the war with a resounding "Woohoo! Russia numero uno." This was going to be about as clear and decisive a victory as the Imperial Russian Navy's even more mentally unstable successor's campaign in the Black Sea against Ukraine. But ignoring that, Russian ships at the time had a short range. They were mostly built to French designs, the battleships at least. There were some native designs as well and also built in US yards, but the battleships, the core of them being the Borodino class, were built to French tumble-home designs at the time. Suffice it to say, they're not the most buoyant. Russia also had no refueling ports between Europe and Asia, the Asian port itself being, Port Arthur, the one that's under siege. Russian ships were all designed for Russian waters. Shocking, I know. Cold places. But that wasn't important, it was time to smack Japan silly and win the war. The greatest thing that the Russian Navy had going for it was Admiral Roshesvensky, and the fact that he wasn't corrupt, which is somewhat an ingrained tradition in the Russian naval command structure, and he was actually competent. This again is somewhat of a rarity in Russian upper command structures, totally wild. A Russian commander who isn't incompetent? Say it ain't so. And Admiral Roshesvensky would also beat senseless, yes with his fist, anyone who severely annoyed him or mildly ticked him off. And so, on the 15th of October 1904, 45 Russian ships with chartered freighters following them set sail for the Far East. Well, west. They had to go west first to go east. It's a whole thing, don't worry, look at the map. However, before the ships even left, the new battleship Orel, Eagle, had a worker remove a panel in its hull and go home for the night. Ignoring the fact that boats do in fact need to be watertight, the ship promptly sank at its mooring. Just for fun too, there was a second ship in the squadron also called Orel, for reasons. So the fleet set sail, a fleet including ironclads, modern pre-dreadnoughts, an aristocratic yacht with a gun bolted to it, a hospital ship, an icebreaker, which is going to the tropics, okay, and a smattering of new and newish cruisers, including the very sexy Aurora, which I will take any chance I can to show off on this channel. Oh, and by the way, these crews were mostly conscripts from Central Russia, the famously aquatic Central Russia, and most had never even seen the sea before. and they were commanded by captains who would like to anchor their ships behind cruisers so they could leave and go and get drunk for the night without Roshesvensky noticing. These ships were provided with enough ammunition for a major battle with a little extra. So gunnery practice, not necessary and not expected. The ships left harbour, well some of them. The flagship immediately ran aground and a cruiser lost an anchor, no idea how, and a destroyer rammed a battleship, but the ships finally left harbour. And then as the fleet was beginning to pass Denmark, a crisis happened. Random sailors began to start screaming that they were all doomed because Japanese torpedo boats were waiting near Sweden to kill them all. Geography not being a Russian strong suit even to this day. And so the fleet then began accidentally ramming Danish coal ships, trying to refuel them. And another ship had a lifeboat fall off. It just fell off. The icebreaker then proceeded to be handled so poorly and flopping around so much in the sea that Roshesvensky started shooting at it to send it home. We have not passed Jutland in Denmark yet. Now, some people try and defend this insanity by pointing out that the ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy at the time were all largely built in Britain. This is true. However, I challenge you in secret to crash build a fleet of torpedo boats and ship crews from Japan to Britain to man them in 1905 before the 2nd Pacific Squadron has sailed, which it sailed on, essentially crash sailing through an emergency. It's not exactly going to work. Admiral Roshesvensky would then try to calm everyone down by giving the simple order that no vessel should be allowed to get in amongst the fleet. This order went out just as a fishing vessel carrying messages from the Tsar arrived to tell Roshesvensky that he had been promoted. None of the warships, who the majority of which started shooting at said fishing boat, came close to hitting it, and the fishing boat's captain, reportedly, wasn't aware he was being shot at. The repair ship Kamchatka proceeded to declare she was being attacked on all sides by 8 torpedo boats. Nobody else saw them. Kamchatka proceeded to say, "Oh, they went away because we turned." Because famously, small boats stop attacking you if you turn away. Maybe the Black Sea Fleet should try that. More on Kamchatka later. The fleet began to close in on Dogger Bank, and then it finally happened. Torpedo boats. The fleet immediately turned to fire, all guns blazing, shells raining from the heavens with multiple ships reporting that they had been torpedoed, and their crewmen laying on the deck preparing for the ships to sink. Crewmen ran around the decks, fighting off boarders, firing pistols and swinging their swords. The battleships at last damaged 4 of their targets, and they even sank one. Victory was finally at hand. At last, the Variag and the defeats in the east would be finally avenged. However, 2 of the damaged targets were the Aurora and the Dmitry Donskoy, decidedly not Japanese, and the rest were British trawlers from Hull. Many of the ships had fired off all their ammunition and hit nothing. The British public were so annoyed that they wanted a war because they could not believe someone could be so monumentally stupid and pig-headed, and that this was in fact an accident. The entire Royal Navy in Europe was put on standby, and they outnumbered the Russians at least 4-1, with Admiral Beresford commenting that he would only use 4 battleships to sink the Russian fleet based on the caliber of their gunnery, as any more would be simply unfair. Admiral Roshesvensky decided that it was maybe time to leave European waters, but he did dock first and ditch as many horribly useless officers as possible, including a particular captain who he wanted to beat senseless on the bridge of his flagship a couple days earlier. He went back to St. Petersburg to get reinforcements. The fleet then split, with the older ships going through the Mediterranean via the Suez Canal, and the newest and fastest Russian ships going around the Cape, with both fleets then meeting in Madagascar. The Kamchatka now appeared, saying she had been attacked constantly, and fired 300 shells against 3 Japanese ships. These Japanese ships included a Swedish merchantman, a French merchantman, and a German trawler. She didn't hit anything. Oh, and as the fleet left Tangier, a ship broke the underwater telegraph cable with its anchor. So, Tangier could now no longer talk to its ruling colonial capital city. Given the Kamchatka had done her level best to start a war with 3 out of the 4 largest naval powers on Earth, the United States being the only one that wasn't included, Roshesvensky now decided the Kamchatka best stay close to the flagship, so he could periodically scream at it and throw his binoculars at it. To avoid constant refueling, the Russian ships would store coal quite literally everywhere, including crew quarters, corridors. Pretty much if you've got an empty pillowcase, you're putting coal on it. And therefore, the ships would be turned into fuel air bombs. And remember how the ships were designed for the cold. Believe it or not, it's quite hot in Africa. And crewmen would then start dying from the coal dust that was literally everywhere, including inside their lungs. A storm suddenly hit the fleet, and out of nowhere, Kamchatka said alarmingly, "Do you see torpedo boats?" Near Africa. At about this point, Admiral Roshesvensky began to develop nicknames for ships and captains who particularly pissed him off. Some highlights include the slutty old geezer, the brainless nihilist, also known as Twitter, and other colourful ones including the lecherous slut, aka the artist formerly known as Kamchatka. When a ship particularly annoyed Rossosvensky, he put it in the naughty corner, aka he just put it behind the flagship, and proceeded to use a yieldy microphone to scream at the ship while throwing binoculars at them. His staff had thankfully bought 50 pairs, and it is said to this day you can track the progress of the fleet across the bottom of the ocean by finding binoculars. That is a joke. Someone will take that literally, that's a joke. As Rossosvensky's squadron grounded Cape Town, he found that the captain, who he had managed to piss off back to St. Petersburg, was coming with reinforcements in the form of the 3rd Pacific Squadron, which was entirely comprised of ships known as the Sink by Themselves Squadron. Rossosvensky proceeded to refuse to tell anyone where he was, so that they would not be able to rendezvous or find him in the slightest. The admiral in charge of the 3rd Pacific Squadron therefore received the following order. You are to rendezvous with Admiral Rossosvensky, whose route is currently unknown to us. Right about now, the ships were passing South Africa, and the British commander in Durban warned the Russians, just in case they got a little scared, that British fishing boats were out and about. Just to avoid them being scared senseless. News filtered through as the ships arrived in Madagascar that Port Arthur had surrendered and the Russian ships there had been sunk. This was a tremendous blow to morale. But now, it's quiz time. Will the Russian fleet in Madagascar do the following? A. Wait patiently. B. Relax their crews and train a bit. C. Start a floating zoo, including having poisonous snakes attacking the crew, a crocodile on board, and a collection of monkeys while also doing exercises and accidentally shooting the Aurora during a funeral for a dead crew member. If you got C, you win a bicky. Somebody sent Admiral Rossosvensky a parrot at this point, and the parrot proceeded to learn every single swear word in the Russian language, while the flagship itself was overrun with chameleons. I suppose at least you wouldn't be able to see them, so if you pretend really hard, the problem just sort of goes away. The poor Aurora became so full of creatures that the crew was refusing to sleep due to a fear of becoming food. At about this point, the fleet's cold storage broke down, and hundreds of tons of rotting meat was thrown overboard. This therefore added the aquarium to the floating circus sitting in the harbour, as it attracted all manner of sharks and other sea creatures. Admiral Rossosvensky would get very, very sick around now, and his chief of staff would proceed to have a brain hemorrhage. Stress definitely not being a factor, and as the old saying goes, their injuries were definitely not service-related. So the ship stayed in harbour, and every single STD known to humanity became commonplace amongst the fleet. But don't worry, it got a lot worse, as religious zealotry, mental breakdowns, and revolutionary talk became commonplace throughout the fleet. One crew member proceeded to start walking around the decks naked, asking everyone if they feared death in his best Davy Jones impression, albeit with less tentacles. Rossosvensky would recover. Somehow, mentally he's probably gone at this point. But he discovered that many of his officers were absolutely off their faces on opium and other hard drugs, Madagascar being the core of this trade at the time. It is unknown whether this addiction improved their performance or not, the bar being, in fact, incredibly low. Finally, a supply ship arrived with ammunition. And never mind its 12,000 winter boots and coats. In Madagascar. Lemurs were starting to get a little out of hand at this point on Aurora, who somehow undertook a competent boat race with her lifeboats. Aurora in general is an example of competency during this fleet, and honestly it did not deserve this shit. What Aurora goes through makes me understand why it started the bloody revolution. More friendly fire later, including a nearly torpedoing of a destroyer and a signal from Kamchatka saying, "Oh no, I am sinking," probably making everyone happy, and finally the fleet would leave port. The ships then met with the Admiral Gorchakov, excitedly ready for letters from home. The crew then discovered that the letters that they had sent from Madagascar, aboard the freighter, were still there. The freighter having gotten lost, sailing in a big circle, and then coming back. Sadly, the inevitable happened on the 11th of November 1905. The 3rd Pacific Squadron found Rossosvensky near Vietnam. And oh boy, they were even more useless. Rossosvensky was completely at his wit's end at this point. He wanted to resign, he begged to resign, he was completely done, and the Tsar promptly said no. To the Tsar's credit, this was a doomed endeavour, and Rossosvensky was quite literally the one chance they had of even surviving, so I understand why he said no. The ships then sailed north together for battle with the Japanese, and promptly were absolutely slaughtered. 5,045 dead, 803 injured, 6,016 captured, 6 battleships sunk, 1 coastal battleship sunk, 14 other ships sunk, 2 battleships captured, 2 coastal battleships captured, 1 destroyer captured, 6 ships disarmed, and much, much more damage throughout the fleet. Some ships would escape, taking shelter in the Philippines, controlled by the United States at the time, and some of these captured ships and sunk ships would actually be put back into Japanese service throughout the First World War. The Variag that I mentioned earlier ended back up in Japanese service, and then was actually sold back to the Russians, quite interestingly, but never made it back due to the revolution. To their credit, some ships would fight incredibly hard, and they put up such a stiff resistance against almost unbeatable odds that, as I mentioned, they were able to get away. But the reality was that any hope of victory was so far gone it's not even funny. In 1906, Rossosvenski faced a court-martial for the disaster, along with each of his surviving battleship commanders. Some of these commanders were sentenced to prison, and some to a firing spree, either losing the battle or surrendering on the high seas to the Japanese. Rossosvenski, wounded and rendered unconscious for most of the battle, was naturally reluctant to accept responsibility for the fiasco, but yet again, proving his immense character, Rossosvenski defended his subordinate commanders, who in many cases did not deserve the defense, and maintained total responsibility for the action, pleading guilty to losing the battle, and opening himself up to the firing squad. The Tsar would commute the captain's death sentences in a show of mercy. Rossosvenski would later pass away from a heart attack on the 14th of April, 1909, not even 10 years after the battle. It isn't known exactly what caused his heart attack, but I would take a bet on any day of the week that he would have lived longer if he did not have to go through this complete comedy of errors. And if you think this is a one-off in history, oh boy do I have news for you. See the attached playlist that this will be going into. The issues that face the 2nd Pacific Squadron are endemic of the Russian Navy, the Soviet Navy, and the Navy of the Russian Federation. And this is something that a lot of people, including my detractors, don't seem to understand. You can point out similar comedies of errors that have occurred in Western navies, such as the British Navy's HMS Captain, the Thresher, the Scorpion, all of these issues happening in the US Navy. But you have to go decades and decades and decades back to find them. This fiasco happened in 1905. The Moskva was not in 1905. The Loshiak was not in 1905. The K-19 was not in 1905. There are so many errors. There's so many screw-ups. The Kuznetsov was not in 1905. The brutal honesty is, the Russian Navy fucking sucks. Round 2. Thank you.
Well, that first video went well, and like I commented, some of the reactions from the Vatnik crowd were just absolutely hilariously funny. I honestly was laughing non-stop, and I have been still laughing as more and more come in. And yes, I will continue to call them Vatniks, because to be completely honest, not a single one of them who commented saying that I was wrong provided a single bloody source as to why that when I followed it didn't start at Kremlin state-run media. Funny how that works, isn't it? But there were a couple of comments about the submarines, the famous red submarines. And let me tell you a little secret about Russian submarines and the Russian submarine force. The Russian Navy submarine service, it sucks too. The thing about the Russian Navy is that with the exception of a few brief glimpses in history of what with highly competent leaders such as Ushakov, and I mentioned Rossosvenski, and for the people saying that I was saying that all the leaders were crap, I spent most of the last video praising Rossosvenski and the fact that he would beat up crap officers. I pointed that out pretty clearly. And I also pointed out Admiral Makarov too, but naturally you ignore everything against your little worldview. As I was saying, the thing about the Russian Navy is it's always suffered from the same problem, namely the Russian government. So obsessed with it has it been LARPing as a superpower that it builds ships, or submarines, or whatever, and then just never maintains the damn thing. They just expect it to work. Think of a warship like a 2-year-old child. They run around like a psychopath, and then when you aren't looking, they walk into a glass door or run into a table and something breaks. You have to help the child and make sure that it doesn't happen again, but it inevitably will, because as a parent, your job is quite literally just to keep them alive long enough for them to become somewhat self-aware of danger. Same thing when it comes to ships. They're going to break. They break a lot. You just have to deal with it and fix the damn things. Russia's approach to boat parenting is to make the kid down half a pint of vodka, pull the other half a pint down the kid's throat, give it some crocodile and just sort of wonder what was going to happen and hope for the best. Kuznetsov is a prime example of this. They nicked the damn thing in the 90s from Sevastopol without any kind of facilities to maintain the damn thing, and well, it's a floating hell that is held together by some kind of Rasputin-level voodoo that would make Warhammer 40k fans blush. The submarines, they're in the same boat. Have you ever heard of the Kursk? The Kursk had a brief mention in the last video, and it was one of those fabled death machine Wunderwaffen that was built by the Soviet Union towards the end of it. It was in the late 80s, 90s. It was an Oscar II class nuclear attack submarine. And it was laid down in the dying days of the Union, and it was launched and it joined the Russian Navy in 1994, 3 years after the fall. The Oscar IIs are actually very capable and very strong boats, and when they were, well, and this is the thing, when they were built, the Kursk runs afoul of that old issue when it comes to the Russian Navy and actually putting money into the crew and actually anything that matters rather than the actual hard product initial cost for the build. And, I mean, it was also Russia in the 90s, so the bit of money they did have, they were busy pouring down their own pockets and buying some kind of super mega yacht with it while they all sort of figured out who could be the biggest oligarch. So, in the 90s, the ship had only one deployment, and this was to the Med, and it was to watch the NATO forces responding to the Kosovo crisis, because reasons. Following that, the ship stayed in port right up until the fateful event where it sank. Now, this is a thing that is very common in the Russian Navy, and I couldn't find any sources saying if this happened to the Kursk directly, and it doesn't really make a huge difference on whether or not it did, but it is worth mentioning here. A common trope in Russia, and this is the reason why Kuznetsov sucks so badly, is that due to the lack of facilities, engines and ship systems are left switched on non-stop, which is really bad. Back to the toddler analogy, I challenge you to deal with a child after they miss nap time. Now, the Kursk, while participating in naval exercises just north of Murmansk, this is the first major naval exercise in about 10 years for Russia too, was tasked with firing a pair of dummy torpedoes at the cruiser Pyotr Veliky, as a Kirov class. Side note, I know everyone calls these battle cruisers, but the definition of a battle cruiser is to simply be a battleship that is faster and less armoured than a battleship, and the definition of a battleship is to sit in the line of battle and fire. The Kirovs do neither because the line of battle does not exist in a modern context, so they are cruisers. Big cruisers, yes, but they are not battle cruisers. Battle cruisers died off after the Second World War. Really, they died off after the First, but they were still potting around in the Second World War in the British Navy, so after the Second. Shortly after loading the practice torpedo, it detonated in the tube, blowing away the front of the sub and trapping 23 survivors out of a crew of 118, the rest being killed instantly. Now, this video is titled The Russian Navy Sucks Part 2, and it is about submarines. What we are going to discuss next is pure horror and not the fault of the crew of the Kursk at all. They did exactly what they were told, and that is exactly why they died. The ships themselves, or the submarines, generally aren't the issue with the Russian Navy at first. Well, they're not the root cause at least. Nor is the average sailor or the occasionally competent commander. No, the issue with the Russian Navy is the overall inflated bureaucratic stupidity that is the Russian Admiralty and state, and quite honestly, the fact it functions at all is rather incredible. The lack of any quality control, the corruption, the theft, and the incessant lying to please whatever tin-pot strongman is in charge on any given day are root causes of why the Russian Navy sucks, and yes, the submarines also suck. The crew of the Kursk are victims of this corruption. Now, I can already pick the comments below saying, but Ukraine is corrupt, but the United States is corrupt. Congratulations, I wasn't talking about either of them, but hey, you managed to bring it up. And I don't care. Shut up. This has nothing to do with the price of eggs, and you know it doesn't. By all means though, proceed to rub those two little brain cells together and ramble in the comments for me to have something to laugh at while I sit on the toilet tomorrow morning reading the comments, because I do read them, and I do find them quite funny. Now, Russian President Putin, and he'd only been president for about 4 months at this point, or was immediately informed of the tragedy, according to Russian sources, again, this is all according to Russian sources, and was told by the Navy they had the situation under control and that rescue was imminent. Yeah, remember when I said Russian High Command was shit? Yeah, that hasn't changed much, has it? Putin, meanwhile, waited for 5 days before ending his holiday at the presidential resort in Sochi, on the Black Sea, before heading back to Moscow. Like I said, he was only 4 months into his tenure as president, and the public and the media were extremely critical of this decision to remain at the seaside resort. During this disaster, Putin would blame the media and their criticism of his administration for making the situation worse. Because that's the problem here. The worst part about the Kursk, and the real nightmare juice, is what happened to the men trapped after the bloody thing sank. They did not have to die. And they did. Because the Russian government let them. Because it was better to let them die than allow Western support to at least give the 23 men trapped a chance. I want to reiterate that. Vladimir Putin's government allowed 23 of its own men to suffocate and burn to death in the dark rather than allow Western help for 5 whole days. And no, it wasn't a guarantee that the British or Norwegian naval assistance, which was offered immediately, would have saved the trapped men. They did die within a matter of 6 to 8 hours, again, according to Russian sources. Obviously, NATO wasn't allowed to inspect the bodies of the dead men or the submarine. But they could have had a chance. There was a chance, and instead the Russian government and the head of the Russian Navy, a one Admiral Kuroyedov, Admiral K, he's an asshole, just we'll go with that. Anyway, he proceeded to blame the entire incident on a collision with either a World War II mine or another submarine. Not the craziest thing to initially blame it on. However, he went on to state that the accident had been caused by a serious collision with a NATO submarine, giving no evidence to support this statement. And senior commanders of the Russian fleet repeated this account for more than 2 years after the disaster. Many of them wishing for continued poor relations with Russia and the West, and they supported this scenario based on that propaganda line. You can tell Russian leaders are lying when their mouths are moving. Now, the particularly moronic people online would have you think that the Russians are okay with self-sacrifice and dying for the motherland as it is righteous. The miniseries Chernobyl kind of shows this with the whole I served the Soviet Union thing, which became a meme. And yes, it is correct, there is a certain kind of toxicity in Russia and a basis of personal experience and research, that pain and suffering is seen as masculine and manly and therefore the correct thing for men to do. However, it's not by choice. It never was. Literally 10 seconds of Pizza Hut and drip-fed capitalism was enough to break the Soviet Union. People like nice things, like Pepsi, good food, and not fucking dying. So if somebody tells you that it is manly and heroic to die like the sailors on the Kursk did, well, I can't advocate violence on this platform, but you get the picture. Oh, and by the way, one of the key parts of this, when one of the mothers of the dead crewmen shouted at Putin saying he should, unalive himself with a projectile fired with gunpowder, well, she was forcefully injected with a sedative by a plainclothes nurse and carried off, while her husband was forced to say the line that he asked the nurse to do it. Later on, they came out to say they did not ask the nurse to do it. They were forcefully removed. So why did the torpedo explode inside the Kursk? Was it bad luck? No, it wasn't. It was good old-fashioned leave it in storage well past its use-by date and use a type of explosive the West has outlawed for decades for being too dangerous. Not much has changed. It's been 20 years, but not much has changed. On the 26th of July, almost 2 years after the disaster, the Government Commission and the Russian Prosecutor General Vladimir Ustinov announced that the hydrogen peroxide fuel in the dummy torpedo inside the fourth torpedo launcher had set off the explosion that sank the Kursk. Ustinov released a 133-page volume top-secret report in August 2002, 2 years after the disaster, and the government published a 4-page summary in Rossiyskaya Gazeta. Yes, that. Revealing that stunning breaches of discipline, shoddy, obsolete, and poorly maintained equipment were responsible for the disaster. And that's a quote. Again, not much has changed, has it? The government report confirmed that the Kursk had been sunk by a torpedo explosion caused when high-test peroxide, HTP, a form of highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide, leaked from the cracks in the torpedo's casing. HTP is normally stable until it comes in contact with a catalyst and then rapidly expands, acting as an oxidizer, generally making large volumes of steam and oxygen. It can go up to 5,000 times its normal size. Torpedoes using HTP had been in use since the 1950s, but other navies stopped using them because of the danger inherent in their design. HMS Sidon sank in 1955, killing 13 sailors when an experimental torpedo containing HTP exploded as it was being loaded aboard. The Royal Navy stopped using HTP decades before the Russian Navy did. It's actually not proven if the Russians have completely stopped using HTP today, by the way. Just side note, I couldn't find anything to say they weren't using HTP today, after it had already blown up one of their submarines. There's a reason why the Russians choose HTP, and they chose it during this period. It was cheaper. The same reason that the RBMK reactor was not refitted. It was cheaper. Remember, this is Russia. Whatever's cheaper, it goes. And they want to know the best part and the reason why HTP was chosen? Vice Premier Ilya Klebanov, chairman of the government commission investigating the accident, suggested the disaster had been caused by a NATO vessel collision, And one of the reasons he did this is because he was the head of the defense industries, and over the objections of even some of the other officers, promoted the use of HTP torpedoes over safer alternatives to save money. I wonder what he did with that money. Another Russian admiral further went on to say that none of the crew knew how to operate HTP torpedoes or had ever even touched one before. The government's final report found that the officers who had issued the order approving the use of HTP torpedoes did not have the authority to do so, and naturally they moved the blame away from the politician responsible and to the lower rank and file. Woo! Go Russian Navy! Several sources also state one of the practice torpedoes, possibly the one in question, had been dropped during transport, and there had been a crack formed in the casing. But the weapon was stowed aboard the submarine anyway, and because the crane that could have lifted it out was broken, it was just left there. Maintenance reports revealed that the practice torpedo carried by the Kursk came from a batch of about 10 manufactured in 1990. So technically it was in date, however the casing was so cracked and so broken reportedly, that 6 of these torpedoes made from this batch were rejected due to faulty welding. So 6 out of 10, 60%, we're at a good start. And because the torpedoes were not designed to carry warheads, they weren't really inspected with any level of scrutiny. I see a problem with that. I don't know if any of you do, but I see a problem with that. There are other issues too with the Kursk, like the escape capsules being inaccessible, the automatic recordings not working, and the rescue buoy being disabled, and more. However, thank God for this. The one thing the Russians got absolutely right on the Kursk, the automatic reactor shutdown worked, and it worked very well. Thank Christ for that. So, despite the many lapses in procedure and equipment, Ustinov, that prosecutor, said that no charges would be filed because the disaster was caused by a technical malfunction and blame could not be placed on specific individuals. Yeah, I wonder why he said that. He said that all of the sailors had died within 8 hours and none of them could have been rescued in the time of ALOR. Again, possible they could not have been rescued, but we'll never know because the Russians rejected any help. At a news conference announcing the inquiry, he absolved the torpedo's manufacturer of any fault. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Those who designed the torpedo couldn't foresee the possibility of its explosion. Fuel does not explode." Apparently, that's what he said. He also said there was no evidence that the torpedo had been damaged when it was loaded onto the Kursk. Even though multiple eyewitnesses said it had, we'll just ignore that. And yes, I know it was a practice torpedo. And the idea of a practice torpedo is it doesn't explode. But however, it's full of HTP. HTP goes fucking boom. So yeah, the Russian Navy sucks. And this includes the submarine fleet. All of those sailors who died on the Kursk died because of the same reasons the men in the 2nd Pacific Squadron and the men on the Moskva died. Sometimes countries just don't get how to navy. And the sheer power of the corruption and the that'll do mentality that Russia has towards its fleet, it has horrific consequences. And it will continue to have horrific consequences. And yes, I know this is just one example, but this video has gone on long enough. Would you like me to make a part 3? I can talk about the Widowmaker. Yeah, the submarine that was nicknamed the Widowmaker. Because I will make that if you want me to. Have you ever worked in an office? Like a really small one, specifically run by an executive team that is technologically illiterate. Your computers are usually about 20 years old at best, and the monitors are weirdly square and have this funny looking aspect ratio. You can genuinely usually see the pixels on screen as well, and in general you just sort of wonder how the hell it hasn't burned down yet. Now take that feeling, multiply it by 52,000 tons, and add in a hefty dose of compensation, and you're approaching the territory inhabited by the most horrific machines ever created by the Soviet Union. The aircraft carriers. I have written this introduction about 6 times. Truth be told, I really just didn't know where to start. The Admiral Kuznetsov, that floating hell, well, many videos of it exist, and they talk about it and why it's particularly horrific. The thing is, though, when you're making a video about something that is horrifically shit, you have to ask yourself a very important question. Where the fuck do I start? And for that reason, I've opted to start at the beginning of Soviet naval aviation. The Moskva. No, not that one. That one. The Moskva and the Leningrad were a pair of helicopter carriers laid down during the 60s, and were truly the first proper foray into naval aviation by the Soviet Navy. At this point in history, the Soviet Navy truly had a decision that it needed to make. Would it A. Focus on a defensive navy, understanding that we'll never be able to get supremacy against Western naval forces outside maybe the Baltic Sea. Or B, enter into a dick measuring contest that I could never hope to afford. I will let you figure out which one they chose. Just keep those 2 points in mind throughout this video. The Moskva and the Leningrad, the 2 ships in this class, and they were built, as with basically every major ship, in the Mykolaiv shipyard in the Ukrainian SSR. Now, originally 12 of these ships were planned as flotilla leaders for submarine hunters, but honestly, on par for the course for Soviet and Russian shipbuilding, they plan a lot but never actually build it. Now, this is partially due to the fact that these ships handled about as well as Aeroflot handles passenger safety. So, yeah. And instead of ironing out the kinks, they just simply cancelled the idea. That said, these 2 horrifically ugly, and I mean horrifically ugly ships, were quite a smart decision by Soviet High Command, at least in theory. Being relatively smaller and not attempting to compete against the Western carriers, but being able to deploy choppers to destroy submarines. Defend the ports, perfectly sane idea. The idea was promptly scrapped, and the Kiev class was planned and laid down. Now, this is usually the point where tankies or wannabe tankies, also known as Trotskyists who never got the chance to run over people in tanks, bring up the Montreux Convention, saying that the design had to be this way because otherwise they would be stuck in the Black Sea. To that I bring up the Ulyanovsk. Didn't stop them planning and starting to build that, did it? Now, the Kievs. These things were actually a product of the Soviet government desperately trying to cut corners on paying for an actual aircraft carrier. This will come as no shock to people here, I am sure. I have seen particular groups of people online rant about how these carriers were actually the best, because they could do many roles. You know, that whole jack of all trades kind of thing that Laserpig actually touched on in his T-14 Armada video. And it's true, they could launch a lot of missiles, and they could also carry aircraft. The USS Kitty Hawk, the US equivalent of this period, couldn't launch that many missiles, no. But the Kitty Hawk could have that many aircraft in the air that it could sink your battle group before you even knew you were in the same time zone as it. So, yeah, the jack of all trades, it's a nice theory, but in a naval sense, it's something you do when you're trying to save money. It's not something you do when you're actually trying to build a good navy. The general idea of the Kievs was to power project, defend against submarines, and to provide air support. This sort of worked, and truth be told, I have a soft spot for these ships. I think they look quite cool. But their planes, the Yak-38, those things were just death traps. And they killed multiple pilots. The Yak-38 tended to quite literally just fall from the sky. And it's somewhat telling, and the reason they gave for this was so they could hold larger payloads. But the moment they could, the Yak-38s were stopped from being able to use their VTOL capability, and instead they used a short takeoff capability. So, make from that what you will. Now, during the first deployment of this class, funnily enough, only 6 Yak-38s were even operable. So the Soviets, to look stronger than they actually are, painted different numbers on the planes below deck to make it look like they had more in the hangars. This ruse worked, in part at least in the press, with some magazines reporting that the things could carry up to 60 aircraft. Whether NATO navies knew about it, well, we won't know. The Soviets built 3 of the Kiev class, and 1 additional ship to a slight variation known as the Baku subclass. This is again another common thing that the Soviet Navy and Russian Navy does, is they build one design, and they'll build probably half a dozen or so of that design. And then they'll build a slightly revised design. It'll still fall under that subgroup, but it'll be completely different. I mean, look at the Krivak class frigates. Like, a Krivak 1 and a Krivak 5 are completely different ships, yet they all fall under the Krivak subgroup. It's a weird thing you'll get used to with Soviet naval jargon, essentially, and how they handle their ship classes, so it's just something to be aware of. It's quite interesting. The ships that were built were the Kiev, the Minsk, the Novorossiysk, and the Baku. Unfortunately, these ships were plagued by maintenance issues throughout their existence, and honestly, as were all Soviet large ships. In the case of Novorossiysk, she had such a bad fire in her engine rooms that she was scrapped in Pohang, South Korea, shortly after the fall of the Union. She was just not worth trying to fix. Weirdly enough, the first 2 ships, Kiev and Minsk, are now a theme park exhibit and a luxury hotel in China. Because that's what you do with an old clapped-out Soviet aircraft carrier when you're done with it. You make it into a theme park. You know what? I can't fault it. I would if I could. I absolutely would if I could. The last ship in the class, Baku, is now the INS Vikramaditya. It's Indian. It's in the Indian Navy, and it's got the prefix INS, and it starts with a V. How she got there is quite a funny tale, and it's a good indicator of, well, what the Russian Navy is like, and Russia in general. So the deal of a lifetime.
The worst trade deal ever made.
Baku entered service in 1987 and then was renamed Admiral Gorshkov in 1991. She was then deactivated in 1996 because she was too expensive to operate on a post-Cold War budget. India at this time was looking for a way to expand its carrier aviation capabilities. and on the 20th of January 2004, after years of negotiation, Russia and India signed off on a deal for the ship. The ship itself would be free, while India would pay US $800 million for the upgrade and refit of the vessel, and an additional $1 billion US for the aircraft and weapon systems. The deal also included the purchase of 12 single-seat MiG-29Ks and 4 dual-seat MiG-29K UBs, with an option for 14 more aircraft. The total cost, US $1 billion, that was not going to last. Further to this, there would be 6 camera of Ka-31 Helix reconnaissance and anti-submarine helicopters, torpedo tubes, missile systems, and RD units. It was the works. The carrier was going to get refitted for them. The immense upgrade involved stripping all weaponry and missile launcher tubes from the ship's foredeck, converting the Gorshkov from a hybrid carrier-cruiser into a pure through-deck aircraft carrier. The announced delivery date for the INSV was August 2008, allowing the carrier to enter service just as the light carrier, the INS Virat, retired, Virat being the former HMS Hermes of Falklands fame. She would then have her life extended. Now the delays would begin. Issues were compounded by ongoing cost overruns, leading to high-level diplomatic exchanges between India and Russia. India finally agreed to pay an additional $1.2 billion for the project, doubling the cost just to get the bloody thing done on time. However, ongoing difficulty with the delivery schedule pushed the expected delivery back to 2013. In July 2008, Russia reportedly needed to increase the price by $2 billion, blaming the unexpected cost overruns on the deteriorated condition of the ship, and citing a market price for a new aircraft carrier of $4 billion. Mind you, the carrier was laid down in the 70s, and Russia here was simply grifting the Indians for more money. Russia proceeded to threaten to cancel the deal entirely if India did not pay the increased amount. On the 7th of December 2009, Russian sources indicated final terms had been agreed on, but no delivery date had been set. On the 8th of December 2009, India and Russia were reported to have ended the stalemate over the Admiral Gorshkov price deal by agreeing on a price of $2.2 billion. Moscow had asked for $2.9 billion for the carrier, nearly 3 times what was originally agreed upon by the two sides in 2004. In April 2009, a scandal over the project proceeded to emerge when it came out that a senior Indian Navy officer had been blackmailed to influence the situation and negotiations over the Gorshkov's sale to India. Because of course he had, because this is Russia. I'm just going to ignore his first name. Commodore Singh had been a senior figure supervising the refit of the carrier, working as the principal director of the project in Russia. He was discharged from service for this incident. Remind me again why so many Indians chest thump for Russia online. I tend to wonder, because they grift you the moment they get a chance. They did the same thing with their T-90s. But anyway, all of this, well, it's the lead up to the main event. Now sit back, kids, for it is time for Kuznetsov. Admiral Flotta Sovetsko Soyuza Kuznetsov. Yeah, they picked a very long name, what can I say? It is the very definition of Putin's Russia in ship form. The ship, often painted to look brand new, is the ultimate naval Potemkin village. Now, if you don't know what a Potemkin village is, it is where a country that is exceedingly shit, think North Korea, makes a perfect village or town in eyeshot of their enemy to appear stronger and happier than they actually are. Kuznetsov embodies this ideal to a T. In the modern world, an aircraft carrier is the ultimate status symbol. It allows you to project power all throughout the world and truly be one of the world's most powerful countries. The United States of America can famously appear off your coastline at any given time with one of its 11 supercarriers, and instantly have, in the case of nearly every single nation, a stronger air force than you, not to mention the power of a US battle group. When you do the math, NATO can deploy a total of 15 carrier battle groups across its member states. 15 full carrier battle groups with spare escorts. It is honestly just mental, the projection power that NATO countries have. Britain has 2 carriers that could theoretically form into battle groups. France has 1. Italy has a carrier, granted it's not as big, but it's still quite powerful. And that the US has 11. China has 2 carriers in commission, with another one being built, and then another one sort of on the stocks. We're not too sure how far along it is. India has a pair, and Japan has 2 destroyers that, well, not really destroyers, are they? You can't really call yourself a destroyer when you can launch F-35s, I'm just saying. So when you put all that together, it gives you the situation where Russia needs Kuznetsov to maintain its Potemkin facade of being a superpower. So let's go over Kuznetsov and regale some of the best parts of this hell ship's history. And I'm not kidding when I say hell ship. This thing is so bad that it would make my ancestors who came to Australia on prison ships blush. So Kuznetsov, let's start at the beginning, when she was stolen, because yes, Russia stole this ship. Following the KGB attempted coup in 1991 and the declaration of Ukrainian independence, the ship, built in Ukraine, being fitted out in Ukraine, was therefore declared Ukrainian property by the Ukrainian government while being in a Ukrainian port. Just want to emphasize that. Evidently, 2/3 of the ship's company agreed, but we'll get on to this. A Russian admiral from the Northern Fleet gave the order to the captain, however, to sail to Murmansk and join up with the Northern Fleet as a, well, then Soviet, but becoming a Russian ship. He promptly offloaded the 2/3 of the ship's crew who didn't want to abscond to Russia and stole the ship, sailing it incomplete to a port in a country that didn't have the facilities to maintain it, let alone finish it. 4 years would pass, and in 1995, the Russians, eager to try and dick measure and pretend they were still a superpower, sent the Kuznetsov to the Mediterranean to practice flying operations. From the 23rd of December 95 through to the 22nd of March 96, Kuznetsov made its first 90-day Mediterranean deployment, with 13 Su-33s, 2 Su-25s, and 11 choppers aboard. The carrier was accompanied by a frigate, destroyer, and an oiler, and was ordered to perform continuous flight operations until 2100 every single day. Given that the Barents Sea during this time of year basically has no light, it made a lot of sense to send the ship to the Mediterranean. It was the perfect location for the Russians to do this. The moment the ship passed Gibraltar, the freshwater filters proceeded to die, and the crew were limited to 20 minutes of water every single day. So 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes at night. And the heating and air conditioning also didn't work properly on this thing as well. During this deployment, the carrier would lay at anchor off the port of Tartus in Syria, desperately trying to get things to work again before leaving for home. Admiral Kuznetsov would remain in port, preparing for another Mediterranean deployment following this one, scheduled for the winter of 2000 to 2021. This deployment was promptly cancelled due to the explosion and sinking of the nuclear-powered submarine Kursk. See my latest Russian Navy sucks video for more on that. Kuznetsov would participate in the search and rescue operation for the Kursk, along with the salvage operation, in the year 2000. Plans for further significant operations were postponed or cancelled, and the ship would make occasional voyages, with only one major deployment to the Med for the foreseeable future. This brings us up to September 2005. During a particular exercise, an Su-33 just fell off the deck while taxiing. It's not that embarrassing. Happens to a lot of nations, to be honest, so we'll let that one slide. Now hell would begin. Hell would really begin. From the 5th of December 2008 to the 2nd of March 2009, Admiral Kuznetsov made its third Mediterranean deployment. On the 5th of December 2008, the carrier and several other vessels left Severomorsk for the Atlantic for a combat training tour, including joint drills with Russia's Black Sea Fleet and visits to several Mediterranean ports. On the 7th of January 2009, a small fire broke out on board the Kuznetsov while she was anchored off Turkey. The fire, caused by a short circuit, led to the death of one crew member by carbon monoxide poisoning. Not even a month later, on the 16th of February 2009, the ship was involved in an incredibly large oil spill off the coast of Ireland. On the 2nd of March 2009, Admiral Kuznetsov would return back to her home port. The Russians admitted that they cocked up royally here regarding the oil spill, but naturally, being the Russian government, it pretended the oil spill was 10 times less than it actually was. I'm not even kidding, they pretended it was exactly 10 times less than it actually was. Until the British turned around and went, you know it's in our backyard and we can see it, right? In late 2011, the Kuznetsov would set sail for Syria on deployment, and this voyage was relatively uneventful until early 2012, when sailing through the Bay of Biscay on her way home. She broke down and had to be towed by an ocean-going tug. From now, Kuznetsov would not sail without having a tug at all times, so unreliable were the engines becoming. Now this unreliability, this is the thing that is talked about a lot with Kuznetsov. Where does it come from? Well, remember when I said they stole it? The thing about Kuznetsov is that flat out, the Russian Navy could just not maintain it. The Russian Federation is, and I cannot stress this enough, not the Soviet Union. It is not the Soviet Union in any way. The only shipyard that could effectively maintain the Kuznetsov once she was built was Mykolaiv in Ukraine, where the ship was built itself. So when she was in port, Kuznetsov, like so many other ships in the Russian Navy, would constantly have her engines running to provide the ship with power. The Kuznetsov ran on fuel so dirty that would make Skid Row look neat and tidy, and it ran on this fuel because it was cheap. Basically burned her boilers out to oblivion, and they will need to be replaced. I want to contrast this to a country that uses conventional aircraft carriers, large ones, and that would be the United Kingdom. They have HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales. The moment these ships sail into Portsmouth, they are effectively switched off, and the port facilities are plugged in, like a big PowerPoint. Think about it like a laptop. When you're at home, you plug your laptop in to charge it. The ships are then constantly maintained, and this is the difference between a competent navy and the Russian navy. Back to the Kuznetsov. So, this brings us up to the most famous deployment of the ship, the 2016-17 deployment to bomb ISIS. The deployment that signaled to all the Vatniks out there that Russia was clearly an uber mega power, and the deployment that signaled to the rest of us the absolute state of this carrier. It should be noted as well that Uncle Vladdy proclaimed this deployment to be his personal idea and took credit for it, so take from that what you will as we get into this. Kuznetsov set sail on October 15, 2016 from Severomorsk in the Murmansk Oblast for the Mediterranean, accompanied by 7 other ships including the cruiser, not battle cruiser, Pyotr Veliki, and 2 Udaloy-class destroyers. The air wing included 6 to 8 Su-33s, 4 MiG-29Ks, some Ka-52s, and a few other choppers. All the Su-33 aircraft had been upgraded with some bomb sights to allow freefall bombing, giving them a limited ground attack capability. At the time, certain analysts suggested that a lack of trained pilots restricted the number of fixed-wing aircraft that could be deployed from the carrier. These people were relentlessly mocked by Russia boos online. Hindsight tells us that they were correct. So this was truly the largest Russian military deployment abroad since the Cold War, and to try and show off the ships sailed via the English Channel. The Royal Navy responded to this affront by sending 2 ships of its own to escort the Russian warships through the channel, probably also to watch for oil spills, but given the size of the black soot plume that follows the Kuznetsov everywhere, they probably weren't that hard to follow. By the 26th of October 2016, the ship was reported to have passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and refueled at sea off the north coast of Africa the following day. On the 3rd of October 2016, the carrier battle group paused off the east coast of Crete. On the 14th of November 2016, a MiG-29K crashed into the sea after taking off from the carrier. The pilot ejected safely from the plane and was rescued by a helicopter. So, the reason this plane crashed, and I'm not even kidding, was because it ran out of fuel while doing laps around the top of the carrier because the arrestor wires were so broken that they couldn't take the weight of the plane landing. The commander could have diverted the aircraft to land by the nearby airbase, but hesitated, thinking that he could get the gear repaired in time. On the 15th of November 2016, as part of a large-scale engagement, Kuznetsov launched Su-33 strikes against positions of the terrorist groups of Islamic State and al-Nusra. Now, this was the first time the carrier had ever participated in combat operations, and the Russian Defense Ministry later claimed that 30 militants had been killed as a result of these strikes, including 3 field commanders. On the 3rd of December 2016, an Su-33 crashed into the sea after attempting to land on the carrier. Same reason, the arrestor wires just snapped. The pilot was safely recovered by a search and rescue helicopter. Later, it was revealed that the arresting gear mechanism again had failed to hold the aircraft, and it itself was damaged in the attempt. Following these 2 incidents of planes just being yeeted into the ocean, the entire air group was transferred ashore to Kemimim Air Base near Latakia to continue military operations while the carrier's arresting gear issues were addressed. The ship would later be ordered back to Russia following this deployment, her aircraft undertaking over 400 sorties. Although it must be noted, less than a quarter of these sorties were actually flown from the ship, and were instead flown from land-based aircraft. So utterly clapped out was the carrier now, they would enter an extended period of maintenance where she still is today. But our story doesn't end here, it just gets worse. Admiral Kuznetsov started an overhaul and modernization program in the first quarter of 2017 to extend its service life by 25 years, finally addressing the issues in the power plant and electronics, according to Russian sources. On the 30th of October 2018, disaster would strike again, with floating dry dock PD-50 losing power and sinking. Remember when I said there weren't actually the facilities to maintain this ship outside of, Mykolaiv, where it was built? Well, the one thing that could take the weight and to get it out of the water was this floating dry dock. And while this dock was sinking, a 70-ton crane smashed into the ship's flight deck, leaving behind a 19 square metre, or 200 square foot, gaping hole. 1 person was reported missing, this is Russian naval code speak for dead, and 4 were injured as the dry dock sank in Kola Bay. The ship was actually in the process of being removed from the dock when the incident occurred and was towed to a nearby yard. The cost of repairing the damage was estimated to be at about $1 million. Now, this is just the damage to the carrier, not to the floating dry dock. It was fucked. You'd think, though, being that it was holding the glorious flagship, the dry dock would have a backup system. A generator, perhaps, with a fuel tank? You'd be correct in this assumption. However, 2 sources disagree here on what happened. Truthfully, they're both fucking hilarious, so you pick whichever one you want. Either the plant manager siphoned off and sold the fuel for money, or he never bought the fuel in the first place and took the money for it. 50-50, both are hilarious. In late May 2019, repair work of the aircraft carrier was again underway. That same month, it was also announced that 2 large graving docks in Murmansk would be merged and enlarged to accommodate the ship. The work would take about a year and a half. It had taken over 20 years since the fall of the Soviet Union when the Russians got the ship, but they were going to finally make a dry dock to fix the bloody thing. In December 2019, a major fire broke out on board the ship as work continued on the refit. 2 people died, and more than a dozen were injured in the fire, and damage was again estimated to be about 8 million. In June 2021, Vladimir Korolev, Vice President of the United Shipbuilding Corporation, announced that the overhaul and upgrade package of Kuznetsov was expected to be completed by the first half of 2023. In November 2021, it was reported that bad weather had caused significant delays to repair work, which might push back the completion of the refit by more than 1 year. Now, a fun thing you can do, and this is something the Russians seem to keep forgetting, is you can look up weather reports on Google, and I had a Google of the weather in Murmansk around this time. It varied between light rain, light snow, and about 3 or 4 thunderstorms. Must have been horrific if it stopped work. Must have been really bad light rain and light snow. The ship was finally dry docked on the 20th of May 2022. By the 27th of July 2022, the dry dock had been drained, allowing repairs on the aircraft carrier to commence. On the 15th of August 2022, the head of the United Shipbuilding Corporation confirmed that Kuznetsov would be handed over to the Russian Navy in the first quarter of 2024, and that the ship is expected to remain in service for at least another 25 years. On the 22nd of December 2022, the ship caught fire again. The fire was extinguished and there were no casualties. The aircraft carrier was then removed from the dry dock on the 21st of February 2023, although it was initially reported that the operation had been suspended due to heavy fog. The Russian Navy claims the ship will be back in service in 2024, but given the absolute state of the Russian military and, well, Russia as a whole, I mean, just look at the ruble compared to the US dollar right now to give you a kind of an indication of how Russia's going. I would like to take a comment from a previous video that I have made on the Russian Navy and apply it to the Kuznetsov. And this is from someone saying that either their close family relative or friend was a shipbuilder in the Mykolaiv shipyard. Just let it die. Now, the Russians have this wild and wacky supercarrier replacement idea planned for the Kuznetsov, the Storm. But personally, I don't think it will ever be completed, considering they're still building 2 landing ships that are set to take over a decade. And if they are all completed, they probably won't be. Odds are, well, what kind of state are they going to be in? Meanwhile, the Kuznetsov's sister ship, Varyag, she was about 60% complete when the Soviet Union fell, and she was sold to the Chinese. China has since completed the ship, and she is in service with no reported major screw-ups. Granted, it's the Chinese Navy, so you wouldn't know if there was anything, but still, Kuznetsov tends to fuck up massively in front of the camera. If Lian Lang is doing it, then it's quite quiet. The Chinese would actually even build a larger ship based on the Kuznetsov's lines, the Shandong, and she is still in active service as of today. They are no Nimitz-class freighter machines, but by all accounts they appear to be competent ships, and managed quite competently. Similarly, the ex-Baku in Indian service has had very few incidents occur, reinforcing the point it isn't the ship, it's the whole rotten structure. The Widowmaker, or more historically accurately, Hiroshima, imagine that, nicknaming your own submarine Hiroshima, will be the next installment in this series. And I will probably take a little bit longer given that I have to explain something about nuclear physics in it, and I know, well, somewhere between jack shit and fuck all about nuclear physics from a scientific standpoint, so I got a lot of reading to do.
You know, the funny thing about the Russian Navy is that it is just so horrific that I can keep making more and more episodes. No, seriously, I have not even begun to scratch the surface yet. Like, we're not even there. So let's get on to it with a lesser known, but even more colossal Soviet screw-up that once again was stopped by self-sacrifice. It's time, after months of waiting, for K-19. Now, I should clarify, I called this boat the Widowmaker in Russian Navy Sucks Part 2. This is an after-the-fact invention to sell tickets to the Harrison Ford movie from 2002 that is not very accurate according to some nuclear-inclined people I've spoken to. The crew itself called it Hiroshima. after the city in Japan, they got wiped out in a horrific nuclear explosion, because that's better than Widowmaker, I guess. Also, I'm aware I pronounce it nuclear, not nuclear. Now, I speak English, not English simplified, so for those that this particularly annoys, I recommend a teaspoon of cement or a strong whiskey. Either should suffice to keep you going through this experience while you listen to me pronounce English correctly. So, what is the K-19, and where did it come from? Well, in the late 50s, the Soviet Union was smack bang into the Khrushchev thaw after Stalin, and tensions were well and truly on the rise in Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It had become pretty clear at this point that if both sides engaged on land, NATO would have the nuclear edge. The great equalizer was the boomer. No, not that kind, although when they get told no, they tend to blow up in the same way. Nuclear-armed submarines that could fire from a concealed position allowed the Soviets to truly threaten the continental United States, and in return, the US using these boats could ensure that the MAD, or mutually assured destruction, would occur if the Soviets fired first. And in 1957, when the K-19 was laid down, the West, well, it had a lead in the nuclear subs-arm race, and the Soviets, well, they needed to catch up quickly. You know where this is going, don't you? Now, what was life like for the crew on the early Soviet nuclear boomers? Well, the crews on the Soviet subs were actually treated pretty well. They were given a high-quality standard of food when compared to the general public, with smoked fish, sausages, fine chocolates, and cheeses, unlike the standard food given to crews, which is, it's not great. It's just not. You're going to soon see why. The bad luck started before K-19 even hit the water, before it was even finished being built. Multiple workers were killed during the submarine's construction, with 2 workers losing their lives when a fire. We'll get on to more fires later. 6 women being killed by fumes while gluing rubber lining to a water cistern. And to top off the construction, an electrician was crushed to death by a missile tube cover, and an engineer fell between 2 compartments and died. We're not even in the water, and the kill count on this one is racking up very quickly, isn't it? In an almost poetic turn of events, the Soviets decided to have a captain smash the ceremonial bottle of wine over the boat. The bottle of wine proceeded to slide along the propellers and bounce off the rubber-coated hull into the sea. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. Now, I'm going to do my best with the next part, and I thank the actual nuclear physicists and atomically inclined people in this community who have reached out and helped me a lot here. But word to the warning, some of this is going to be proper nightmare juice, so, just be ready. The first uh-oh moment occurred in January 1960, during a watch change ceremony, where improper operation of the reactor bent a control rod. This necessitated the reactor being dismantled, and the captain was very quickly demoted. I've asked 3 nuclear physicists and nuclear industry personnel how they bent a control rod. The responses I got were, it's the Soviets, they probably figured a way out how, and I have no fucking idea. That is a direct quote. So, these are people who work in the nuclear industry day to day, and they have no idea how they managed to bend that control rod so well. But it is what it is. The submarine would now conduct some tests, including her sea trials. So she tried a full power run on the 12th of November 1960. The submarine then surfaced, and the crew found that most of the hull's rubber coating had fallen off, so they needed to put some more on. During a maximum depth test dive down to 300 meters or 980 feet, flooding was reported in the reactor space. The captain ordered the submarine to surface as fast as possible, where a distinct list was noticed to port. Turns out that during the construction, a gasket was not replaced by workers, and the galley crew disposed of wood crates through the waste system, clogging it. This caused flooding in the 9th compartment. Because, that's what you do with the crate that you want to get rid of. You stick it down the drain. Later, in December 1960, a loss of coolant was caused when the main circuit pump failed, and specialists were called in from Severodonetsk. The boat was now finally commissioned on the 30th of April 1961 with a total of 139 men aboard. All that happened before it was even accepted into service into the Soviet Navy, so we're going well. We're going well on this one. As a side note, upon commissioning, the executive officer was Vasily Arkhipov. He would later be the sole reason a nuclear torpedo wasn't fired at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which would have most definitely sparked a nuclear exchange. Arkhipov is one of those examples of extreme competency, right up there with Roshesvensky, in the middle of a nightmare. Speaking of nightmares, we're here. It's time to never sleep again. On the 4th of July, 1961, in the middle of our first patrol, having already killed 10 workers during construction, shedding her rubber skin and bending a control rod, the engineers on board noticed that there was something mildly alarming. There was a loss of coolant in the reactor. Now, I have been informed that this is in fact a bad thing to occur when nuclear fuel is allowed to start to get very hot. The reactor was immediately shut down, but now decay heat still exists, and I'm going to explain this as best as I can with the help of a lot of people, so thank you very much. So based on multiple figures, and they're using sort of Western reactors here, but it's nuclear physics, and I've been told that it all sort of works similar in the sense that decay heat is decay heat. So, decay heat still exists even though the reactor's shut down, and it is about 1/3 of the reactor's thermal power when on load, and it starts to shed. Now, according to a nuclear-brained person, they said that the reactor on 1/3 would have had the thermal equivalent of about 9,000 average homes without cooling. Just to head off the expected comments when it comes to the relating power mentioned above for decay heat, thermal energy does not translate 1-to-1 with electrical energy. In reality, if you did, then the 23 megawatts would be enough for 9,000 homes, but as an example, a reactor at 1/3 power is about 9,000 homes worth of electricity, according to unclassified Soviet things. So, like, whether or not this is all true, we don't exactly know, because the Soviets, well, they're kind of known for classifying stuff, or especially when it's bad. So, yeah, it's about 9,000 homes worth. So, either way, to make sense of it, even when you turn the reactor off, it's full of spicy juice, basically. That will kill you. Long story short, there's now a bit of an issue going on. Some reports state that the reactor got up to about 850 degrees Celsius during the processes of this incident. For comparison's sake, this is about the same temperature the top layer of cheese is on a pie after 30 seconds in the microwave. These kind of temperatures would have definitely damaged the outer cladding on the reactor fuel, and at the very least, it is likely that a partial meltdown occurred. The reactor itself was right on the edge of a meltdown though. Cladding, by the way, exists primarily to prevent cross-contamination and cool the fuel. At this point, it was becoming somewhat clear to the crew that things aren't exactly going well, and they were indeed up the proverbial creek without a paddle, and there was a very big hole in the canoe, shooting out enough gamma rays to create the communist equivalent of the Hulk. The crew tried to call Moscow, but that didn't work because the long-range radio had been broken by a separate incident earlier in the voyage. Because of course it had been broken, because this is the Soviet Navy. At this point, the radioactive steam that Wiki and many accounts go on with starts, well, floating around. This is most likely due to, and again I'm using somebody way smarter than me in this stuff to explain it, the fuel cans beginning to fail, meaning that you were getting fission products and fuel making direct contact with the water in the compartment and turning very quickly into spicy steam. It becomes really bad that the main ventilation loop for the boats, like air to breathe and stuff, was in the same room. Now this isn't too uncommon with subs, but it isn't exactly a normal thing to do to turn the reactor compartment into the seventh circle of hell. To quote two people from the nuclear industry I've spoken to, the whole sub was, as they say, shit up. Right about now, on the K-19, if you aren't using a respirator, you're in a bit of trouble due to the radiation, in the sense that your insides are going to start turning into goo. This next bit, well, it's that old Soviet adage of horrific human sacrifice being the only way for the state's crappy decisions to be made up for. K-19's engineering team went inside the reactor space, and they bodged in a repair job to get coolant feed back into the reactor and to prevent a complete meltdown on the boat, and from, making Greenland become glow Greenland. The engineers were able to retrofit an air valve to work and to move the feed water back into the reactor to finally cool it down, but in doing so they effectively signed their own death certificate. Not a single member of these heroes would survive beyond a month, and to put that in perspective, the operators from Chernobyl Reactor 4, not all of them survived, but still quite a few did, and the ones that died, in many cases they lasted longer than this crew. The K-19 reactor compartment was so irradiated that some of the engineers were dead from acute radiation syndrome, ARS, in just 6 days. 6 days. And I was going to explain briefly what ARS is, and that was going to be some real nightmare juice, but YouTube won't let me upload that. So if you ever want to never, like, if you ever like have an issue with sleeping too much and you just never want to sleep again, Google what acute radiation syndrome does. You may not want to do that in hindsight, but just it's a thing. Over the next 2 years, a further 15 crew members would succumb to the extreme levels of radiation aboard. The captain, having averted turning Greenland into a glow stick, did the most sensible thing he could and made for an area where he knew there would be a diesel boat on patrol. Nearby warships from the US Navy reached out and were like, bro, you okay there? You're kind of glowing. The Soviet commander decided to say everything was fine and refuse American help. It is understandable considering the Hotel Class K-19 was technically, ignoring the fact that this thing is at this point is a literal death trap, the most advanced vessel in the Soviet fleet. Now, K-19 met up with the S-270, and the crew was moved off the boat onto the diesel sub, and the death trap was put under tow back to the Soviet Union. Now, if you had a submarine that had already killed 10 people in construction, and then turned a portion of the crew into radioactive goo, would you maybe want to get rid of it, retire it, could even turn part of it into a memorial, research what went wrong with it? No. This is the Soviet Union. You put that baby back into service within 2 years after cutting out the reactor and contaminating miles and miles of surrounding area. K-19 was now nicknamed Hiroshima by the crew and was put straight back into service in 1963. The murder boat would serve out the rest of her career quietly and safely. I'm just kidding, this ride is not over yet. Weirdly, the nuclear incident that made the sub famous wasn't actually the deadliest thing to happen on that boat. On the 15th of November at 7:13 in the morning, K-19 collided with the Permit-class nuclear attack submarine USS Gato in the Barents Sea at the depth of about 60 meters or 200 feet. K-19 blew her ballast and reached the surface. The impact completely destroyed the bow sonar systems and mangled the covers of the 4 torpedo tubes. K-19 returned to port and rejoined the fleet. USS Gato was fine and continued its patrol. We're still going. Believe me, I want this one to end too, but the horror show, it's still coming. On February 24th, 1972, the boat again caught fire. And now this was at a depth of about 120 meters or 390 feet below the surface. And this is about 1,300 kilometers or 700 nautical miles off Newfoundland in Canada. The boat surfaced, and the crew was evacuated to surface warships nearby, save for the 12 men trapped in the aft torpedo compartment. Towing was delayed due to weather, and the rescuers could not reach the men due to the conditions of the engine room. The fire killed 28 sailors outright, and a further 2 after they were evacuated. The fire was caused by hydraulic fluid that wasn't contained correctly, dripping into a hot filter. K-19 was again repaired and put back into service. On the 15th of November 1972, you're never going to guess what happened. Well, another fire broke out in compartment 6, but thankfully the fire extinguisher actually worked this time and nobody died, which is a tremendous surprise that no one was dead from this one. On the 15th of August 1982, another electrical fault caused another fire, severely burning 2 sailors, one of which would later die 5 days later. Finally, in 1990, the submarine was finally decommissioned and towed to Nerpa in Murmansk to be scrapped. K-19 had finally stopped killing, but her story isn't over yet. A section of the submarine was purchased by an ex-crew member, Vladimir Romanov, who wanted to turn it into a Moscow-based meeting place to build links between submarine veterans from Russia and other countries. Naturally, those who had survived Hiroshima weren't a fan of this, so he, and I kid you not, turned it into his place of residence in northwest Russia. I don't even know anymore. I don't understand. Why are they like this? Sweden, the soon-to-be final part of Lake NATO, a nation known for PewDiePie, IKEA, meatballs, a very, very nice-looking wooden ship that can't really sail upright, and genuinely really nice people. But what if I told you that they were secretly a nation of maniacs, with plans directed at the Soviet Union and Russia that would make the Finns and the Poles blush? Well, you're in for a treat as I descended to the deep lore that is the Swedish defense plans, and how a Soviet submarine very nearly triggered them by crashing onto a rock and getting stuck. Yes, that is right. The Soviets nearly made Sweden, the country that had been neutral for literally a century, turn into the doom guy through sheer incompetence. A bit of background. The Soviets, for the most part, vanity projects aside, understood that they would never be able to fight the Western powers at sea and win. So they built a metric shit ton of diesel submarines, or diesel-electric submarines, to supplement their nuclear boats in order to essentially flood the sea with as many submarines as possible and gain a numerical advantage. Think T-72 but underwater. It's meh and not that great, but there's a lot of them, it'll do something. Now, there are some benefits to electric boats too. They are quieter in some cases. Well, Western ones are quieter. We don't talk about how loud Soviet submarines are, but by the by. And given that this is the Baltic, they kind of fit the theatre quite well. One of these classes of submarines were the Projects 613, 640, 644, and 665, the NATO reporting name being Whiskey. Now, the Soviets built 236 of them from 1950 to 1958. And by 1981, when our story starts, they were really, really long in the tooth. And probably in quite the horrific state, considering this is the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, in the throes of economic stagnation and, well, just general sadness. Our particular glass of sadness in question was the S-363, laid down on the 12th of January 1956 and commissioned on the 17th of September 1957 in Leningrad. She was 76 meters long, weighed about 1,000 tons, and was armed with 6 torpedo tubes, with 18 torpedoes or 24 sea mines as her weapons. She had a crew of about 60 and could plod along at a respectable 18 knots surfaced and 13 knots submerged. Nothing special, but it's a cheap diesel electric, it's quite dangerous if undetected, and it's really the kind of boat you're looking for trade interdiction and surveillance. A comparable boat would be, for example, this one, the HMAS Onslow, which is now a museum ship in Sydney. Very much an older design, great at spying though. In the blue corner you have the Swedes, the country that determined the Red Bear was really the only threat. This was done shortly after the Corporal played Russian roulette in 1945, and it had built itself up in preparation for a war. In a naval sense, during the Second World War, Sweden's naval forces had largely been responsible for ensuring that she remained neutral and was not invaded by German forces. Centered around really powerful coastal battleships, defense vessels, and cruisers, it was very much a case of any invasion by the Germans would simply be far too costly, and her fleet and being truly worked wonders. Had the Germans tried it, it is very likely that you would see a fair few repeats of what the Norwegians did to the Blucher. And quite simply, Germany didn't want to risk her bigger ships. Why would she when she could simply keep trade open? And everything was fine. It's not like Sweden was going to say no to trade, they were covered on each side by an Axis member. With the Soviet threat on the horizon, the Swedish Navy reorganised itself to meet the current threat, discarding larger, more powerful coastal defence battleships and cruisers and turning their guns into coastal batteries, with smaller submarines, destroyers, and corvettes truly becoming a modern, if not very small, fighting force with a singular goal. That goal being that if the Soviets tried it, they would pay in blood. On the evening of the 27th of October 1981, Soviet submarine S-363 bonked into an underwater rock about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles from the south coast naval base at Karlskrona, and it was forced to surface very much inside of Swedish waters and was now stuck firmly on the rock. It was, kind of obvious to the Swedes who were conducting a naval exercise next door to where the submarine was stuck on a rock. A Swedish officer, having been informed by a local, made his way over, unarmed, and boarded the submarine, and in something that must have been out of a Monty Python skit, walked up to the conning tower and met with the Soviet captain. The gist of their conversation being, why the ever-loving shit are you here, and how did this happen? And the Soviet submarine captain responding with saying that There were simultaneous failures of all navigational equipment, and it had caused the boat to get lost. Please ignore the fact that we have somehow navigated through rocks, straits, and islands and a multitude of other nautical obstacles to get to this point in the first place. Given that this is the Soviet navies in the 80s, a sudden rush of incompetence and shit to the brain, and breaking of equipment is somewhat to be believed, if not expected. Most likely, though, they were spying on the nearby naval exercise taking place at Karlskrona. The Soviets, being allergic to telling the truth about basically anything due to their obsession with saving face, see China, would later issue a statement with the claim that the boat was forced into Swedish waters, past rocks, straits and islands and other naval vessels that could have helped it, due to severe distress. Now, whether Ivan and Yuri caused this distress by eating all the doctor's sausage and drinking all the vodka, we may never know, but it is safe to say that the statement was somewhere between utter crap and complete bollocks. The Soviet reaction to the grounding of the submarine on the rocks about 20 kilometers from Karlskrona officially was, as I said, an accident. Unofficially, they appear to have crapped themselves and sent multiple aircraft to search for the bloody thing. Swedish reports hint at the fact the Soviets didn't exactly know where the submarine was at first, just that it was lost, at least until news broke, with the general thought being that the sub was grounded at Kristanzio, a completely different geographical area to where it actually was. Worth pointing out here that the sub-captain had exceptional experience with navigation according to both Swedish and Soviet sources, at least allegedly. Now, it is possible, and according to a Swedish report which, and I quote, argues that the military authorities of the Soviet Union were not always competent. See, it's not just me. The Swedes think it too, that this was all a Soviet naval shenanigan, and it was possible that it was a distraction because the Soviets knew that they'd been found out and caught, which they had. This is somewhat evidenced by the fact that Soviet naval vessels, including a Krivat-class frigate, made their way to the area where the sub had now appeared, and externally, visually, they looked to be cleared for action. What is funny, though, is that the Soviets claim the submarine only started having on the issues on the 28th, when it got stuck on the rock on the 27th. There is a bit of a time lapse difference here due to time zones, so I'm willing to give them that one. So, two versions of events here. TLDR, myself and a Swedish investigator are of the belief that the Soviets had no frickin' idea where the submarine actually was, but they knew they were up the proverbial creek and needed to find a way to save face, and hopefully get a paddle. Now back on the sub, after having a chat with the Soviet captain and probably just ignoring him for half of it, because in my experience, Swedes are actually loath to fight anyone verbally, and, well, because he was watching a Soviet captain tell him everything was broken while he himself was staring at a perfectly fine gyro compass, yes, there was nothing wrong with it, Sweden launched an official diplomatic protest, calling the Soviet Union a very naughty boy and asking it to kindly bugger up and go home. At the same time, the coastal Jaegers were ordered into position in preparation if something funny was about to happen. Well, funnier than what had already happened with the submarine. As an interesting anecdote, they were ordered to wear their berets and not their helmets because, and I quote, it looked better. Which, yeah, I get that, drip is important, but it does show that the High Command in Sweden wasn't exactly expecting a fight to break out. In response to the diplomatic protest, the Soviets, being the Soviets, lied and said that the gyro compass was still broken, and that the submarine was there on accident, having wandered into and grounded on the 28th, not the 27th, but we spoke about that. And the best part is they still claimed that they were on Kristanzio, which means they weren't violating Swedish waters. No, they were violating Danish ones, which makes it better, I guess. Understandably, the Swedes were a little pissed off about this. They did not screw around with their borders. It was likely that they would not have the happiest response. So the submarine remains stuck, and a weird sort of limbo begins. Right about now, the Swedes decide, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, and they claim, considering the sub is there, in their waters, on their rock, next to their naval base, that they have salvage rights. The Kremlin, kicking and screaming, finally acknowledged that they breached Swedish waters and they said sorry. The Soviets, still hoping at this point to be seen as incompetent rather than malicious for reasons of saving face, are still hoping they'll get the submarine back. There'll be no fuss and everything will be fine. Sweden, on the other hand, is about 2 points short of popping a blood vessel and like a proper mad lad turned around, flipped the Soviet Union the diplomatic bird, and decided they would investigate what has happened further. After being guaranteed some political immunity, the Soviet captain was taken off the boat and interrogated in the presence of Soviet officials. Meanwhile, the Swedish naval officers began examining instruments and the logbooks of the Soviet submarine. The Soviets really didn't have much of a choice here, given that they were, well, stuck on a rock in front of Swedish coastal guns and half the Swedish Navy, so it's like, what can they actually do? And it's not like they're going anywhere. And now you may be wondering, what could little old Sweden, the country with a tiny population, do against the might of the Soviet Union? Well, the answer is...
Total force Varsjans.
And no, I didn't just summon Thor or flat-pack furniture. Total Defense Service is and was the Swedish plan on what exactly to do if war were ever going to be declared, and make no mistake, Sweden knew war would only come from one direction and one only, the old enemy, Moscow. Directly from the Swedish government's explanation, everyone between the ages of 16 and 70 living in Sweden is part of Sweden's total defence, and, if necessary, must help Sweden prepare for war. The obligation is called Total Defence Service, and this includes conscription in the armed forces, civilian service in, for example, emergency services departments or the armed forces, and general compulsory national service, which only applies in the event of a heightened state of alert. Quite simply, the idea is that every man, woman and child, whether he or she likes it, has one purpose and one purpose only should war ever come to Sweden. Kill the Reds. With that in mind, the entire Swedish military is built around this defensive strategy. For example, the Swedish Navy does not have large warships in the modern era. They have smaller craft such as the Visby-class corvette, which can move quickly and use geography to hold the border. Similarly, the tanks are designed with this in mind, hence the cheese wedge, I love the cheese wedge, and the hottest of all IFVs, the CV-90. The Swedish Air Force as well is built for this kind of asymmetric total warfare, having the ability to use any number of main roads and even side roads as bases, with quite literally hangars built into the side of mountains. Not unlike the kind of sneaky stuff you see Ukraine pulling off right now. There is the distinct reason that the Swedish jets can take off and operate on very short runways. Also, side note, love the Dorito too. Look at it, it's great. To explain it in simple terms, the Swedish defense plan broke down to a very pragmatic, we can't win, we will lose land, but the land we will lose will be rendered inhospitable, and the invader will lose so many men that it will not be worth it. A true blood for the blood god kind of mentality, because quite simply, there would be nothing left to lose. In the midst of all this planning, the Soviets rammed a submarine onto a rock next to one of their naval bases and tried to order them around. The Swedes, thinking things were a bit sus, had a few scanners set up to try and check if the whiskey had any warheads aboard. And that's when the news came out that that submarine had nuclear weapons aboard. So a Soviet submarine with nuclear weapons was stuck on a rock in front of Sweden's premier naval base. This could only go well. Now, the grown-up thing to do would be to admit you had done goofed and apologise to Sweden, work out a deal, get the submarine back, maybe work out some compensation, and say sorry. Notice I said apologise twice in that sentence. Yeah. This is the Cold War. Nobody is exactly pragmatic, nobody is exactly sane. The Soviets, being absolute gigabrains, responded to Sweden, and being understandably a little mad at their territory being violated, by ordering 12 warships and a Spetsnaz team to sail straight into Swedish waters and forcefully remove the submarine. The Swedes, having been pushed to their absolute limit, snapped at this outright declaration of an intent to go to war, and the Prime Minister, upon being briefed by his defence force, gave the order. Haul guns and hold the border. As the warships left Kaliningrad and crossed the Baltic, vegan fighter jets armed with anti-ship missiles took to the skies, with orders to sink any and all Soviet vessels who enter Swedish waters. So too were the coastal artillery units put on full alert, and right about now, Sweden went completely radio silent. Not a peep could be heard by the Soviet naval commander in charge of that squadron. What he may not have initially realised was that that was the signal that Sweden was for all intents and purposes on a war footing and was ready to go should the Soviets cross the border. The Soviet commander contacted Kaliningrad and said the equivalent of, it appears they're not backing down. And within half a mile, I'm not even kidding, half a mile of Swedish waters, the Soviet ships came to a complete stop. And in the great staring contest, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and little old Sweden, the USSR blinked. In the end, diplomacy would win the day. You'd have some Swedish shenanigans of, for example, aiming at and completely locking onto Soviet warships and having the Soviets panic before all of a sudden not doing it and not firing. And other little incidents like that, helicopters tracking other ships, submarines surfacing next to Soviet unarmed vessels going, you really want to screw around? And when I say unarmed vessels, I mean salvage vessels which were there to nick the submarine and take it back. But, as I said, in the end, diplomacy won the day. The Swedish Navy escorted the submarine to international waters, letting them know, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And now the Whiskey on the Rocks incident isn't really discussed much in the Western world. Swedes know about it though. and rightfully so. If you would like to look at a far more detailed insight into what happened from the Swedish perspective, have a look at Scruffy Tales. I'll put a link to his channel in the description, and this is his channel here on screen. He has only 1,000 subs, and he really deserves more. The level of research he put into his video is genuinely incredible, and I stumbled upon it when I was looking as to whether or not I would cover the topic. I tend to not want to cover topics that are largely covered by other channels, to put something fresh out there. Like, for example, I'm not going to touch the Russian Air Force. That's Anamaki's domain. He's working on a script and I've seen it. It's a huge script. And last I saw it, he was still in World War II, so God forbid that man has to get that done. But given that there is an ungodly number of Swedes in my audience, like, there is a genuine lot of you. There are not many Swedes in this world, yet you make up a very significant part of my audience. It's kind of shocking. And the sheer absurdity of everything that happened, I couldn't resist making this video.
Valery Sablin. Alright, I got it. He's in that Hoi 4 mod with a terrible UI. In 1975, the Soviet Union was in a bit of a state. Most of the annual budget, after all, had been going into the maintenance of Brezhnev's eyebrows, and funneling weapons into whatever country's opposition the CIA was funneling weapons to. But during this magical time of kleptocratic insanity, and bodging of new nuclear power plants, which totally won't come back to haunt them in 11 years, the average person in the Soviet Union kind of noticed things were getting a bit crap. As in really crap. As in, oh god, the economy is dying crap, but hey, never mind, let's laugh at the silly Americans for the fall of Saigon on the 30th of April. Imagine that. Intervening in a war, only having to withdraw. Wouldn't be us! Anyway. On a more serious note, by 1975 things were not going well in the Soviet Union economically, as the country entered what we now call the era of Great Stagnation. Following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, and with the collective sigh of relief that quite literally everyone except for the politicians felt, the Soviet Union went through a period known collectively what we call in the West as the Khrushchev Thaw. This period saw an end to the extremely repressive policies of the Stalinist era, as Steve Buscemi liberated the entire nation by taking the drastic step of not shooting everybody who sneezes in the slightly wrong communist way. The thaw also included fiscal reforms that would actually benefit the Soviet economy quite a bit, such as the introduction of a minimum wage, and the expansion of media and arts and, cultural things, nice things. Khrushchev, though, went a bit too hard, too fast, due to what can be described as his personal vendetta against Stalin, and in this he alienated many of the supporters who still held Stalin in high regard, possibly suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. One of such people was Leonid Eyebrow Brezhnev, who ousted Khrushchev as leader in 1964. And although initially the Soviet economy would prosper, because Khrushchev had done all the nice things, and Brezhnev wasn't the worst initially, Brezhnev's reintroduction of Stalinist policies would signal the end of that thaw, and it began to inhibit economic growth. To put it plainly, the Soviets decided to spend more and more money on their military and not other silly things like, the proletariat. Guess what? You can't eat a T-Series tank. Right into space, though. The slowing of the Soviet economy matched up perfectly with the beginning of a gerontocracy within the Soviet Union. That's when you have really old people in government who, should have retired anyway. Congress. Anyway, this furthered the lag being experienced by the USSR against its Western adversaries. Brezhnev's much more violent reaction to anti-communist uprisings such as the Prague Spring in 1968, where we get the term tanky from, furthered the USSR's return to a more oppressive state, with a leader doing his best to role-play Stalin. Brezhnev was particularly angsty when it came to ensuring that communism remained in place in the Soviet satellites. Generally speaking, in an attempt to overcome the economic depression, the Soviet Union attempted large infrastructure projects, in particular in the field of atomic energy, to provide cheaper alternatives to power the state. The lack of resources caused by the economic situation led to unsafe practices, and the bureaucrats, each attempting to fulfill orders given from the level above them and trying to one-up each other to steal each other's jobs and, communist Soviet things,
Meanwhile, in the background, the Soviets weren't entirely blind to just how shitty things were getting under their dear leader. Some of these people even had guns, and on the 8th of November, one of them, having a sudden rush of shit to the brain and thinking this would end in any other way than a loud bang in a hole in his head, decided to channel the voodoo of Lenin and bring sexy back to the Soviet Union by using the ship he was on to imitate the famous Aurora. Valery Sablin, by all accounts a very highly competent naval officer who had quite a brain and was quite a good graduate, was going to stoke the fires of revolution and bring communism back like it was 1917 all over again. On the 9th of November 1975, captain of the 3rd rank, yep, Soviet ranking is weird, don't worry about it, he's an officer and the ship's political commissar. Valery Sablin, aboard the frigate Storozhevoy, went to his captain to report there were some sailors below deck completely off their face drunk. The captain, being a captain in the Soviet Navy in the 70s and understanding drunkenness was just Tuesday on a slow week, followed the officer below deck to discipline the men likely probably going to beat them, because it's the Soviet Navy during the 70s. Upon reaching the lower decks and noticing that it was in fact empty, about a fisticuffs ensued, and the two men fought each other, with Sablin detaining the captain and other officers in the forward sonar compartment. Sablin then called a meeting of the remaining senior sailors and loyal officers aboard, and he allowed them to vote as to whether they stayed aboard or not. He laid out that the Soviet leaders were all corrupt. Yes! And that they betrayed the revolution and abandoned Marxist-Leninism. Yes! And that his plan was to steam to Leningrad, the home of the revolution, and broadcast a message which would be revolutionary, and he would do this by parking his revolutionary ship next to another revolutionary ship, the Aurora, to restart the revolution. Can you tell that he was a die-hard communist yet? Of the 15 officers Sablin assembled, 8 of them said, sure, yeah, why not, let's do this, thinking it was a great idea, and the rest were, brutally beaten and thrown below. Because it was the Soviet Navy in the 70s. With the officers on side, or beaten to a pulp 50-50, our intrepid adventurer with his comrades turned his attention to the crew of 150 men. Sablin was pretty popular though, and he gave a revolutionary speech promising a big revolution, a huge revolution, the greatest revolution you can imagine. Like it was going to be such a revolution that people would be tired of revolutions. And the whole crew basically enthusiastically agreed, or according to some sources after persuasion, they enthusiastically agreed. One of the officers, seeing that saying no meant getting a beating, agreed to the mutiny, and at the first chance he could snuck off to warn the guards that there was in fact a mutiny occurring. The guard didn't believe him because such things don't happen in the Soviet Navy and such initiative is not welcome in Comrade Eyebrow's Soviet Union, so naturally both the guard and the officer would wind up being tortured, starved, and beaten by the KGB after first being accused of being drunk. Realising that they may now be detected, a Krivak-class frigate not at all being the stealthiest, Sablin decided to set sail straight away. His original plan was to undertake the mutiny at sea, once the fleet had sailed on an exercise, allegedly. But given the circumstances, he thought leaving straight away would give him the best chance at victory. And so the Storozhevoy set sail, her radars turned off to avoid detection, to start a revolution in a communist country. This may be a good time to pause to explain what exactly the Storozhevoy was. Storozhevoy, meaning guardian or sentry in Russian, was a Berezvetnik class anti-submarine frigate. In NATO language, it's a Krivak 1, which is the term I'm going to be using because I'm not saying Berezvetnik about 30 times in a 20 or so minute video. The Krivaks were another one of those jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none hull things that look really imposing and are somewhat decent but are generally speaking just kind of mid. It's a frigate, okay? It isn't some kind of Wunderwaffe, it'll escort things well, it'll kill submarines, but like the Nox, it has limitations. It's not an Oliver Hazard Perry which has some kind of weird Rasputin-level stay-aliveness that no one really understands no matter what it gets hit by. The Storozhevoy, one of 21 Krivak 1s, was of the frigate variety, designed mostly to hunt NATO submarines and shoot aircraft down. A regular run-of-the-mill kind of frigate. I think they look kind of cool personally. But the Krivaks could kind of do everything depending on what they were outfitted for. To an extent. The KGB Coast Guard and now the FSB Coast Guard even use them. Yeah, that's right, the State Security Service has frigates, don't worry about it, it's Russia. Speaking of CIA frigates, when? Anyway, back to the mutiny. Probably because Sablin was too busy hugging a life-size body pillow of Lenin or something. A junior officer escaped his confinement below decks and found his way to a radio. It appears that this could have been a short-ranged radio somewhere else on board, but it's kind of speculatory. All we know is he made his way to a radio. But he was able to alert the authorities to the fact that something was, in fact, happening. This time, they actually listened. And fearful of a repeat of the defection of Jonas Pleskis to Sweden, the Soviet commanders gave the order that the ship, under all circumstances, must be stopped. According to some reports, as soon as the ship cleared the mouth of the Gulf of Riga, 13 ships of the Baltic Fleet, in their ports and at sea already, sortied, along with 13 warplanes, amongst them Yak-28 bombers, who incidentally this would be the one and only time they would actually get to fire in anger at their own ship. The Soviets were in a bit of a tricky situation here, as they wanted to recover the ship, but not to destroy it if they could avoid it, because, it's kind of hard to explain why you bombed your own frigate to the Swedish and NATO, who would, sort of notice this thing. Also, there's 150 crew aboard, and try explaining that to the bomber pilots that you have to kill 150 of your own comrades. But anyway, now the official story is that they knew what was going on the whole time, and that they never lost the ship. The reality was that the only ships close enough to stop the ship in those first few hours were outgunned by the frigate, and they didn't particularly fancy getting smacked around, although it is arguable whether or not Sablin would have fought the ship against his erstwhile comrades, if it came to push to shove. The Soviet command realised the closer ship's shortcomings, and decided that they would set the bombers onto the Storozheboy, but they weren't exactly sure where it was, and it kinda looked like a lot of other Soviet frigates out on the water, which is a slight issue. Now that the situation was getting a bit out of hand, aka the government ministers were shitting them bricks that the ship would defect to Sweden, the order to sink the ship was getting more and more frantic. Don't worry about the fact there's 150 crew aboard and they might be innocent. The poor conditions limited the bombers' visibility, and they struggled to find it. Probably didn't help that they weren't exactly trained to bomb ships in the first place, but don't worry about it. And a second squad of Yaks found a large ship and began bombing it. But it was a cargo ship. Shooting the wrong target. Again, old habits die hard, huh? And so, another squad of Yaks went up, and somehow somebody had a brainwave that the ship might be closer to Soviet waters. Remember how I said, though, that the Soviet Navy had been shadowing the ship? Well, they hadn't actually reported to the Air Force because reasons. So the Soviet Navy never actually lost the ship, they just didn't tell anyone where they knew it was. The most accepted reason being that they didn't think the Air Force squadron of Yaks would be tasked to stop it. There was still one Yak from the 2nd Bomber Squadron in the air though, and it was over near Gotland, and it found 2 large frigates in the water. One of them was the flagship of the Pursuit Squadron, and after getting really low and disobeying orders, the other was the Storozheboy. The bomber proceeded to drop multiple payloads both in front of and behind the ship in an attempt to disable her, as well as firing their cannons into the sea. Eventually this was quite effective, and it appears that the steering gear aboard the Storozheboy was disabled. Right on cue though, more Soviet bombers arrived and started bombing the wrong frigate. Namely, they were bombing the ship chasing the Storozheboy, and the patrol boats began to fire to drive off the friendly planes. It's honestly a miracle that the old frigate wasn't destroyed at this point, and both the ships and pilots blamed each other for not designating the correct target. Likely realising their goose was cooked, the Storozheboy came to a stop, and Soviet Marine commandos boarded, only to find Sablin aboard his ship with a hole in his knee and detained by his own crew who had freed their captain. What is likely is that when the crew realised that they were in fact going to die if they kept following him, they had enough. The Storozheboy gingerly made its way back to port, and on arrival, Sablin was brutally beaten and then arrested by the KGB, who would starve him and torture him during the interrogation, because Soviet Union in the 70s. Sablin was charged with high treason and court-martialed, and 1 year later, although his crime generally only carried a 15-year prison sentence, he was executed. His second-in-command, Alexander Sheen, received an 8-year prison sentence, and the other would-be mutineers were allegedly let go completely scot-free. Allegedly, and according to some sources, the KGB, feeling like they hadn't rammed the message home hard enough, beat the ever-loving crap out of significant portions of the Storozheboy's crew, including the captain who was locked below. This is just allegedly, I'm not entirely sure. It's possible that they were just sent off and told to bugger off, which we all kind of think happened anyway. When we know it happened anyway to an extent because the ship was completely given a new crew, not even 6 months after the incident. The Soviets were genuinely quite embarrassed by the whole fiasco, and they quickly ordered the Storozheboy with that brand new crew to be redeployed to the Far East, and she departed in early 1976 for Petropavlovsk. The rest of her career being relatively quiet, the only notable thing being that she made a port call to the then Ethiopian port of Massawa, modern-day Eritrea, in 1980, and in June 2002 she was sold to an Indian breaker for scrapping. As for Sablin, the Soviets spun a yarn that Sablin's intention was to defect to the United States, which, if you understand the geography of Riga and the Baltic Sea, kinda checks out, but not really. Sablin originally had to sail west to get out of the Gulf of Riga, which makes him have to go towards Gotland and Sweden, which makes the story believable. The reality was that Sablin was going north to Leningrad. The Soviet lie was generally, though, quite believable, and it would actually take until the end of the Cold War for the rest of the West to find out that Sablin never actually intended to defect. He was a Soviet through and through. Sablin remained a dedicated communist until his death, his last letter to his son reading, "Trust the fact that history will judge events honestly, and that you will never have to be embarrassed for what your father did. On no account ever be one of those people who criticize but do not follow through their actions. Such people are hypocrites, weak, worthless people who do not have the power to reconcile their beliefs with their actions. I wish you courage, my dear. Be strong in your belief that life is wonderful. Be positive and believe that the revolution will always win." He followed this up by stating in his farewell letter to his parents that "I am convinced that a revolutionary consciousness will catch fire amongst our people." Now that technically happened. Just not in the way you think. 20 years later, though, the Soviet Union was gone. And ultimately, what Sablin did, in many ways, can be seen as being done for no reason at all. As an interesting anecdote, the American researcher Gregory D. Young wrote his 1982 master's thesis, Mutiny on the Storozhevo, a case study of dissent in the Soviet Navy, on this very topic. It is a fascinating read and I encourage you to check it out. This thesis was stored in the United States Naval Academy, and one day an unknown insurance salesman by the name of Tom Clancy found it, and he loved it. He would adapt it into a book, which would then later become a movie, with the worst sounding Russian accents I've ever heard in human history. The Hunt for Red October. So I expect in about 30 years some random salesman to read my eventually to be published research thesis on the evolution of the Royal Navy from pirates to professionals 1500 to 1750, and I expect a movie with absolutely horrific accents to be published with my name in the accreditations. I'm joking, that'll bore you to death. I wouldn't actually put you through it. Like, comment, subscribe, Patreon link in description, join Discord, all the normal things. Thank you all to the patrons, and I will catch you next time.